Okay then, welcome to Creation in Commons webinar, the best board meeting agenda ever. My name is Dana Gillespie. I'm Creation in Commons Director of a new service offering we have called Raise Together, which helps organizations build exceptional fundraising teams. I'll be your moderator for today. Creation in Commons' mission is to strengthen communities through shared creativity. For over a decade, our organization has elevated how people create and lead together through research, training, and education, strategic planning, branding and marketing, and board development. Today's webinar is led by Carlo Cuesta, Creation in Commons lead consultant and co-founder. Carlo brings over 20 years experience working for and with grassroots, regional, and national nonprofit organizations. In addition, he is an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota and conducts keynotes and workshops for a variety of groups around the country. Today's webinar is expected to last 45 minutes. Before we begin, I'm going to go through just a couple of housekeeping items. You can download today's presentation from the handouts bar on your screen. In addition, we are providing you with a guide on how to put together the best board meeting agenda ever for your organization. You can download these at any time during the presentation. If you have a comment or question during the webinar, please use the Q&A box to submit your question. Carlo will also be stopping throughout the webinar to answer any questions that are submitted. Finally, we'd like you to fill out a post-webinar survey. It will be launched as soon as the webinar is over, as well as sent to you in a follow-up email. At this point, I'm going to turn the workshop over to Carlo so that we can begin. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Well, thank you, Dana, and thank you all for coming out today. I greatly appreciate it. So as we dive into the content of today's workshop, I want to start by talking about board engagement and really looking at the factors that affect or can help change board engagement. And you know, we don't have many tools at our disposal to sort of transform board engagement. I think probably, you know, a good tool in many respects is how do we get our board in contact with the mission experience, the mission impact of our work so that they can see it directly. Another way that we can shape board engagement is really more directly through how that board member is oriented to the organization, how they, when they come onto the board, what they learn about the organization. But really, the arena that my colleagues and I see on a regular basis as having the biggest impact on board engagement is really the board meeting experience in and of itself. And there are really, you know, in many respects on sort of one side of the coin, there is the unengaged board meeting. And this unengaged board meeting is a meeting where there's very little context. So it's very, very hard for a board member to get up to speed. There's lots of reporting that's going on, lots of information, you know, being shared. But it's not necessarily coming from you know, across the whole board. It's really coming from maybe one or two people who are really doing the talking. And the focus isn't necessarily on the board's job, but the focus is really on how do we move this agenda forward? How do we, you know, just, you know, tick off the points that we have listed here on our agenda. Whereas what we see as the engaged board meeting, the meeting that really actually changes the kind of experience that board members have, are meetings that have a high level of contextualization. And in that, board members really feel prepared coming in for a discussion. They feel engaged in that discussion. They feel like they know what's being talked about, what the stakes are, and how to bring their best selves, their skills, their expertise, their background, all of that to the conversation. We also find that these meetings tend to be report light, not report heavy, that they actually you know, utilize in many respects advanced information as well as creating summaries that really help board members prepare the way for a dialogue, for a conversation that's going to be about, quite frankly, the most important questions that the organization can tackle. What this allows for, in many respects, is for everyone to play a role in the conversation, for people to not just sort of sit back and listen to all of this information coming at them, but to really interact with the information, to ask questions, to inquire, to comment, to offer up new ideas and solutions, and to really take the answering of these questions to a new level in many respects. So what we have at our disposal here is really the opportunity to change board engagement by changing the experience. And really the way that we do that within the board meeting is by addressing the agenda. So this is pretty much on your screen here. What you can see is like an old, sort of typical agenda, what I call the old way. These agendas this kind of agenda is very common. This kind of agenda is very report heavy, as you can see, and in many respects doesn't really encourage conversation. But what it also doesn't do is that it doesn't really put the focus of the board in any particular direction. It's just saying here's a lot of information that you need to be aware of, and we would greatly appreciate any comments or questions that you have on these particular pieces of information. And from a timing perspective, if you sort of break down the timing of this, you'll notice that in many respects, to call the meeting to order only takes, it's really quick, it takes 10 seconds to do, we welcome everyone. And then the approval of the minutes, that's like the easiest thing to sort of take care of. It's like, let's approve the minutes, and we check that off, and then we move on, and then things start slowing down from there. We go into the financial report. So that takes about 5 to 10 minutes. Important information we have to know about what's going on. And then there's the executive director's report. And this is typically where I see board meetings getting bogged down, because the executive director gives a summary of what's happened within the last month or within the last couple months. And all of a sudden, the pace of the meeting starts to slow as people begin to settle in to listening to the executive director talk and talk and talk about what's going on and what has happened within the last 30 to 60 to 90 days for the organization. And so this pace slowing down in many respects, kind of, particularly if your board meeting is at 5:30 p.m. or worse yet, let's say at 7 p.m., it begins to sort of, wear people out. And people's interests begin to sort of go in different directions, or they're trying to sort of figure out, where am I supposed to sort of bring my perspective or my ideas and skills as I'm listening to this particular report. And in many respects, as we move into committee reports, that time begins to drag on as well, and the same thing happens and such. Very, very little dialogue, but a lot of talking at you, not talking with you. So in many respects, we look at this as a very, very bad use of time. And what we're really been putting forward with the boards that we've been working with is a different kind of an agenda, a new way. This is an agenda that actually gives the board minutes its due. And I'll talk about why that's important in a moment. It also utilizes, in many respects, a very, very valuable tool in a consent agenda. And if you don't know what a consent agenda is, I will talk about it in a little bit. But if you're already using one, fantastic, keep using it. Obviously, we feel the treasurer's report is very, very important and continues to sort of to have a place of prominence. But in many respects, the heart of the meeting goes to an open discussion around a very specific question that is key to the organization's sustainability and success, that the board needs to address ultimately, and that you give it its due, that within a 90-minute meeting, you give it 50 minutes of your time to have that discussion around that particular question. And that in addition to that 50 minutes of time that you're giving to that, you're giving an additional 20 minutes of time to synthesizing specific committee action or policy action that the board may need to take based off of the conversation that you have. So that out of this discussion may come things that then get delegated out to your specific committees, as well as maybe, quite frankly, larger action the board as a whole may need to take. Then it still leaves time for a little new business at the end, as well as adjourning the meeting. But the point here is that what we're doing is we're placing the focus of the meeting around really a centerpiece of discussion, of dialogue, discourse, and debate around a specific issue that is of great importance to the organization, so that the board can have some comments, to make comment on this, not just in a peripheral way, but to really dive into the issue and understand it at a deeper level. So I want to talk today about our how-to steps. In terms of how you put this workshop together. Like Dana mentioned at the top of the webinar, we are providing not only the slides, which you can download at any time, but also a guide on how to put this kind of meeting together, which provides in more of a narrative format the steps that I'm going to take you through today. But I'm going to talk about first here, the first step, about really changing how you review your board meeting minutes. And this is very important too, about how we build content. And making sure that your board gets comfortable with what that consent agenda is, being the second step in the process. And then the third step, and a very important step, is leveraging your executive committee, and if there is no executive committee, leveraging the board officers and the executive director working together to set the agenda for the organization. And then creating that summary I was talking about, a really high-level, one-page summary that gets board members really oriented to the key question that you're going to be addressing and some of the objectives of the conversation that you're going to be having. And then focusing that whole agenda on that single issue, diving into it. And I'll talk a little bit when we get to that point about the benefits of talking about a single issue. And then finally, how we synthesize that conversation, step 6, in terms of delegating to committees, setting actions, and policies. So let's go ahead and dive into each step, and let's talk a little bit about the approval of the minutes. And like I said, this is the thing that we sort of check off first, right? It's the easiest thing. We ask, do we have approval for the minutes? And then someone says second, I make a motion to approve the minutes, and then someone seconds it, and then all in favor, aye. And then we move on, and and maybe every now and then someone makes a small alteration at a board meeting to the minutes that that they've quickly have read through. But here's the thing that's getting missed here, is that the minutes actually provide really important context about what the board has been working on. That when we talk about the approval of the minutes, we should be using that time not to just approve the minutes, but to actually reorient ourselves to the work of the board, to what occurred in the last board meeting, what actions were taken, and what was learned ultimately, and to begin to ground ourselves as we're moving into this board meeting that we're just starting. So the action here, in many respects, is for the secretary to read the minutes out loud, covering the major points of business from the last meeting, to take that full 5 minutes. And then also for board members to be encouraged to ask clarifying questions so that they can really understand what took place at that board meeting. Think about it as if there was a board member that skipped the previous meeting and they're now coming in. By being able to do this, just taking this 5 minutes to take this step, what it's really allowing you to do is get them up to speed really quickly so that you don't have to backtrack in the middle of the conversation and say, well, we've already discussed that. But that they know up front in many respects, yeah, that was discussed, and they get to actually ask questions about it again, just so that they can help strengthen their understanding of what happened previously so that they're prepared. And you might say, well, wait a second here. That's, they could go ahead and just read the minutes to begin with. And I would say, sure. They can read the minutes to begin with, but when it's done in a formal way, with everyone around the table, there's recognition together about what took place and what is the context of this board meeting moving forward. So obviously the approval process here is once these steps are done, then the board can go ahead and approve the minutes and move forward with the meeting. Let's talk about step 2 here. And under step 2 is a consent agenda, which what's great about a consent agenda is that it's that single action that the board can take to approve things that require little discussion, little formal discussion at the board meeting. So reports that can be read ahead of time, especially reports that, quite frankly, where not much has changed from the previous month. There's not necessarily earth-shattering news that has to be shared. That these reports can be read ahead of time, and that ultimately they can be approved in one fell swoop, recognizing that everyone has acknowledged that they know that those reports are there and that they can read them and reference them. I'm actually a big believer that the executive director's report can go into the consent agenda with other committee reports. I actually feel that this gives, quite frankly, the executive director document a written report for the board, but that it is also the board's job to read that particular report. Now, let's say there is something really pressing going on. Well, frankly, that should be, if there is a pressing issue, that should rise up as a question that you should be addressing at the current board meeting, or a central question you should be addressing at the next board meeting as part of that 50-minute block that we've charted out in this new agenda. So obviously, like I'm saying, don't wrap minutes into the consent agenda. Don't wrap the treasurer's report. Having a financial update on the health of the organization is always important, just so that people can remain in touch with the numbers. I wouldn't wrap that into your consent agenda at all. Like I was saying before, again, if there is a particular issue, not just in the executive director's report, but in a committee report that is of real critical importance, it should rise up as a question that the board needs to be discussing. Otherwise, it should go into the consent agenda. So let's look at how we can tackle step 3, which is leveraging the executive committee. And like I said, typically, many organizations have executive committees. Sometimes they're functional as a committee, sometimes they're not. I think in many respects, one of the best jobs for an executive committee is to answer, in many respects, what is the agenda for the upcoming meeting, and to set that agenda. Let me pause for a moment. Dana, I want to just check with you. Can you hear me? We just got a note from someone that they've lost their audio.
I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Well, if there are other people out there, okay, thank you, Nick. I'm hearing from other people that they can hear me just fine. Okay. We are recording, just so that folks know, we are recording this webinar, and we'll provide access to the recording of this webinar after, just in case there was some audio or technical difficulties that people have experienced here. Okay. And I want to appreciate everyone for chiming in that they can hear. I just want to make sure that everyone was able to stay with us. Okay. So going back to leveraging the executive committee agenda here, the executive committee, it really should happen in many respects 2 weeks prior to your board meeting. And really what the task here is that what they're doing is they're working with the executive director in partnership to really identify what is that key central question that a board needs to discuss. And then also to really define what are the objectives of this discussion as well. and to develop the headlines, and I'll show you an example of that, items that should go on the headlines. Now, there are a difference between what are good central questions and what are bad central questions. And I got to tell you, specificity matters, but sometimes getting too specific doesn't necessarily work very well. This is actually a real central question that I changed around a little bit just to protect the identity of the organization. But how do we mitigate $100,000 in projected income that is at risk for 2016, including our corporate underwriting and new individual contributors' budget goals? So here's an organization that has actually, as it's heading toward the end of its fiscal year, has a really, a significant issue. Instead of just reporting on saying, well, folks, we're having difficulty, closing the gap, this $100,000 in projected income for 2016. The central question is reframing it and putting it up for a point of in-depth discussion here. So really here, the discussion is about, all right, here's the specifics. We're having this $100,000 potential shortfall for 2016 coming from corporate underwriting and new individual contributors. Budget goals. Our objective for today is to develop 2 to 3 strategies to address the potential loss of income we may experience. And so this then becomes the point of really fueling the discussion and opening up the discussion. Where what is a bad central question, oops, I went a little too far here. What is a poor central question is really in many respects of saying, okay, folks, we're going to spend 50 minutes. Here's what our recommendation is. What do you think? Let's open it up for discussion. Now, it's good that you're, in terms of, having some ideas and such ahead of time to share with people. But again, it puts people in a very reactive state rather than a proactive state. The proactive state is saying, let's develop together 2 to 3 strategies to address this potential loss of income. Not necessarily coming back to you and saying, here's the 4 strategies of what we're thinking. What do you think? So you can see the difference in how it's actually presented to the board. And what it does is that it moves the board by how you word the central question and the objective. It moves that board from that reactive state into that proactive state of really looking at, all right, what do we need to do to move forward ultimately? So let's talk a little bit about the headlines advanced read. This is an example, as you can see on the right side here, of what a headlines advanced read could look like. Using that same central question, how do we mitigate $100,000 in projected income that's at risk for 2016? What the objective is, those 2 to 3 strategies, and then really providing what are some of the key background headlines. And this is good because when you're developing this with your executive committee, this is helping orient them to what the key background headlines are. And it allows them to sort of raise certain questions of saying, it might be good if we can offer this kind of information to the board so that it can ground themselves. But I would argue is what we don't want to do is just create a set of background headlines that is like 25 bullet points long. What we want to find really is boiling it down to what are the 4 or 5 bullet points that people need to really know to help understand the issue. So, for instance, here we have 10% toward our $55,000 corporate underwriting goal and 15% toward our $45,000 new individual goal. There's 6 months left in our fiscal, so it provides a good sense of what the current situation is. What are some of the challenges? We are having difficulty identifying potential corporate sponsors. In addition, we need to expand our individual donor prospect list. So there's some diagnosis of what some of the problems are. And then really, what are some of the key challenges as well? Currently, staff time is limited. Board members have expressed the need to try to have training on how to make the ask. So all of a sudden, what we're seeing here is a further contextualization of how we can dive into this discussion so that people feel very, very much aware of what's going on. Now, what I also think that's important is what are some of the other pressing matters and important info that should be put on the table. And on the headlines, advanced read, these 3 or 4 additional bullet points, quite frankly, are good because they help contextualize the above question and objective. Just because you're beginning to see the variety of issues that the organization is facing, and as you are diving into the conversation, you're going to begin to see how board members are going to start connecting up those in the discussion, connecting up and seeing how those issues go together, how they relate to one another. So again, on the headlines advanced read, this is a 1-page summary presenting the organizational question, the discussion objective, background headlines, as well as sharing some pressing matters and other important info that people need to know as they're entering into this particular discussion. Again, I want to encourage you as we're going through this, if you have any questions, to please share them in the question box. Okay. So moving on, let's talk about the single issue agenda and why this is important and how to manage this particular piece of the step in the process. You know, this 15 minutes isn't about sort of let's ask that central question and let's, you know, open it up and see what happens. The board president or the board chair in guiding the conversation is going to have to, you know, present a couple of sort of key questions to help move the conversation along, and to begin to help people get engaged and involved in the conversation. So one of the things that we see is that it's probably good for the board chair to open the floor for questions from board members to help clarify the situation. So obviously, in this particular case, around this $100,000 shortfall, you know, there's going to be questions for the executive director, obviously, but there's also potentially questions for the development chair and the finance chair in this particular scenario. And so the board chair needs to be able to help guide these questions to not just the executive director, but to other people on the board who do have some information to provide as part of really diving into this particular question. So, you know, I was at a board meeting the other night, and the board was set aside 50 minutes for a discussion around the organization's strategic plan. And this was something where the board chair really, you know, started the conversation by really turning to the strategic planning committee chair and really asking that person to sort of, you know, to provide us and bring us up to speed on what's going on, what has happened to date, and to sort of lay out what you're sort of seeing, you know, as we review the critical question that we're asking about the strategic plan, which pertains to mission, vision, and values. You know, what are some of the things we need to know, and please help open up that conversation. And what that does is that gives about sort of 10 minutes of time for further contextualization, so that board members can be asking questions during that time, and as well as get further grounded into the discussion. But then it's really opening it up to the board, and this is again where the board board chair is encouraged to, is trying to encourage people to engage in the conversation by really beginning to sort of say, well, we'd like to, you know, begin to get, your thoughts on some of the specific dynamics about this particular situation. So what are some of the strategies, as you've been hearing about the situation that we're in, that we should be considering? And so documenting of those strategies can be happening during that meeting. either on a piece of flip chart paper or even, even just written down into the minutes of the meeting, which should be done anyways. One of the things that I think is very important, that during this 40 minutes where board members are asked to, share their perspectives and their points of view about the question that we're seeking to answer here, that they should, be encouraged not to edit each other and not to critique the ideas like, oh, we've done that before, or I think we need to, I'm not sure that's a very, very good idea because of this. That board members need to be encouraged to sort of bring those ideas forward in a free fashion where they're encouraged in many respects to build on each other's ideas as opposed to critique each other's ideas. In many respects, you may have heard the term, the kind of yes and conversation, like where someone says something and the next person says yes, and let me build on that by adding this. Yes and conversations for those, for that time period, for the remaining 40 minutes, is really important. One of the things that I would say is before I dive into this particular slide, when we get to the synthesis portion of the meeting, that additional 20 minutes, that, in many respects, what we should also be doing is at that point is really looking at how we take all of the different ideas and strategies that we've developed, and then at that particular point, begin to really sort of synthesize and coalesce around, what are the strategies we're going to pursue, or how are these actions ultimately delegated to specific committees or specific individuals. How should the action be delegated, and then what is ultimately requiring official action here. One of the things, I'd like to go back a slide for a minute because I skipped over this. There are definitely some, implementation best practices. The first one is that we believe that meetings should start on time even when a quorum is not present. If there are certain things to approve at the top of the meeting, that you can then wait until you have the quorum to go back and approve those things like the consent agenda. But it's important that, quite frankly, that, everyone gets, oriented to the fact that meetings begin on time and and that you need to be there on time in order to take part in the conversation. Meeting minutes, and this is very important because meeting minutes should be a little more detailed than just recording sort of the action to be taken, or sort of more detailed than sort of high level items that were discussed, but that it should, in many respects, capture the action taken, who it's delegated to, and then how the action has been delegated in many respects in terms of what people are expecting from that action in terms of either some form of desired result or guidelines in terms of how that action should occur. Also, a best practice is that the executive committee will be tasked with how to effectively schedule what questions get focused on at which board meetings. Now, I'm a big believer that every board meeting at the beginning of every fiscal year, the board should, in many respects, take a look at the board calendar for the year, and that there are some certain standing discussions that fall on the meeting agenda, on the year's meeting agenda. And some of those standing discussions obviously are the approval of the budget. But I also am a big believer that twice a year the organization should set as a central question, what is our progress towards meeting our strategic planning goals? So each board is always a little different in terms of how you set that calendar, But also in between meetings, it's important that the executive committee be responsive about where the organization's at and what critical questions need to be answered, so that they can then ultimately be able to make sure that the question that's going to be discussed at the next board meeting, that that's really relevant ultimately and meaningful to what's going on. So there may be some moving things about, which should be done with consultation with the whole board, but that the executive committees, it's really the executive committee's job to make sure that what questions are addressed and when, that is determined with the utmost relevancy in mind. We have a question. Any suggestions how to transition a board from the old way to this new engaged agenda? Yes, I do. And I in many respects, like to start out with some very, very, very simple tools and where or strategies. Where I like to start in many respects is to start with actually just the reading of the board meeting minutes. Create the context up front. It's a simple, small little change. It takes 5 minutes to do. And and what it will do in many respects is that, again, it creates that grounding and that context that board members need to enter into the meeting. Simple way, just a simple step to take. Obviously, that needs to be something that's talked about with the board officers and also shared with the board that, you're going to take this simple step. We're just going to spend some time making sure we all understand what happened at the last board meeting. And we're going to read the minutes out loud and take any clarifying questions briefly, just for 5 minutes. That's one. The second is to really discuss the utilization of using a consent agenda, because that's what's really creating the space in your board meeting. By creating that consent agenda, what you're able to do then is identify that, create room for that 50 minutes of discussion, because you're able to then think about what goes into that consent agenda. Now, you may haggle with your board, around a couple of those items, what should go in that consent agenda and what shouldn't. Some may feel like, no, we shouldn't be putting the executive director's report in there, or not. So I would say is that if a report a certain report has to stand out in many respects within the consent agenda, that you make sure that you're keeping that to a limited time frame and not a lengthy time frame. Because once it goes to a lengthy time frame, then it should be a central question, and it shouldn't be it shouldn't be a report. So I hope that answers. I hope that answers your question. The final thing that I would say about making the transition ultimately is try it once. Just say to your board is look, we'd like to try this here. Where we're going to work on one central question for 50 minutes during our 90-minute board meeting. We thought we could just experiment with this format and to see how people like it, and then spend a little time at the end of the board meeting, not just asking, did you like it or not like it? Would you want to do this again? Or ask them, how would you improve this? And also ask them, is that if we did this again, could you see this being a part of our regular method that we use in our board meetings, and to see ultimately how the board responds. I have to tell you is that the boards that have made the shift and such to this agenda, once they've tried it, they don't want to go back to the reporting structure. It makes the board meeting much more engaging, much more livelier. Everyone feels like they've had a voice in the discussion, and they feel like it's not just it's voice in the discussion about something very, very meaningful and important. Thank you for your question. So this brings us towards the end of our workshop, and again, I want to make sure that if there's any other questions that you folks have, to please go ahead and send them to me. But before I go through this review, I want to talk about the importance of why answering one question could really change how your board is engaged in the work of the organization. And this ties back to what I was saying earlier about content. When we focus on one question, it's different, what it allows us to do is to take our focus and to place it into one area. And in the exploration of that one area, what it ultimately does is that it unlocks other important aspects of the organization. So we may be talking about this $100,000, possible shortfall that we're experiencing. But that may also come back to, in many respects, the conversation of why the organization may need to really relook at its branding and how it presents itself to the community. It may look at how our board of directors needs to ultimately develop skills and develop its skills, its strengths at fundraising. It may open up conversations in many respects about the relevancy of our programs, most importantly, and their impact on the community, and who is ultimate, and how visible that impact is, who's seeing that impact and who's not seeing that impact. So, we may be talking about a $100,000 shortfall, but by giving it the time to have the discussion, what you're going to see is you're going to be touching upon and digging into a deeper conversation that leads into other important issues and aspects of the organization. So what it does in many respects is that it starts out with great specificity, but it allows you then to create meaningful connection to other critical questions that you may have to answer over time, which then begins to help the executive committee to really continuously shape and keep relevant what questions the board is going to be tackling from meeting to meeting. There's been a lot of research that's been done on boards and their ability to there's been a lot of research done on how boards feel engaged and not engaged in the board meeting. That in many respects, board engagement always seems to come at a time of either of crisis, not necessarily at that, sort of from meeting to meeting as maybe challenges may be mounting or challenges may be being addressed. But quite frankly, it's sort of board engagement goes from sort of where it is today, and then it's faced with a challenge, and people ramp up in many respects to meet that kind of challenge. That is, as one person once said to me, is like the board is bored most of the time, and what I would say is by moving to this kind of format, what you're doing is you're saying, there are always questions that we have to be, critical questions that we have to be addressing. And during times of great success for the organization, what these critical questions allow you to do is to actually move out in time, to be able to answer questions today that will be meaningful 4, 5, 6 months from now. And also when, quite frankly, when there are challenges on the table that are a little bit more relevant, it allows you to organize those challenges and to bring focus to the discussion around those challenges, not to just report out on them. So what it does is, in many respects, is that it helps the board to really understand where to put its focus and where to put its energy by moving. And it keeps reminding them that, about their responsibility on a strategic level to be able to help the organization address these critical questions in order to maintain and sustain the health of the organization. So the steps that we take to do this, in summation, is one, really to change how you review your board meeting minutes. Take that step. 2, to get comfortable with the consent agenda. 3, to leverage executive committee, the executive committee to set the agenda. 4, to create a headlines one-page advanced read. Very important. You know, we send out a lot of paper to people, folks. Them having, you know, one sheet that they can look at that really contextualizes and focuses the meeting is going to help a lot in moving that discussion forward. 5, focusing that agenda on that single issue. And then 6, delegating, doing that synthesis where we're delegating to committees and setting actions and policies as needed based on the discussions that we've been having. We're going to be wrapping up here in a moment. I'm going to turn this back over to Dana to bring us home. We did have another question where someone asked if there's any recommended templates for best practices on board meeting minutes. You know, we just put together one for one of my colleagues in my firm has just put together one, and Nick, I'd be more than happy to share that with you offline via email. And if there's others, please, if you'd like to get that template as well. It's very, very bare bones, but I think it might be very helpful for you to see and to utilize. But at this point, let me turn it over to Dana, and she's going to let you know that I am going to stay on 5 minutes for an additional 5 minutes to take any further questions that come up.
Okay, thank you, Carlo. That brings us to the conclusion of our webinar, The Best Board Meeting Agenda Ever. Don't forget to download the presentation and the guide documents, and let us know if you have any problems with that. In early January, we will be announcing our winter-spring webinar and training schedule. Please watch your email boxes for an announcement, or you can check out our website at creationincommon.com. Like Carlo said, he will stay on the line for 5 minutes to answer any questions you might have. And I want to thank you very much for joining us and hope you have a very pleasant day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So I'm going to wait out here in the internet ether if you to see if any further questions come up on the chat. Here are a couple, and I can start taking them. Here's one that says, building on previous question about transitioning to a new way, how can you best make this happen if the organization has not had a history of working in committees and sharing their reports at board meetings? For example, having to use some of our board meeting time working on new strategic plans. So it's a challenge to work on multiple key headline issues. Yeah, that's a really great question. One of the things that I want to say is about this is that, you know, we're actually working with a small organization. It's a board that's about 3 years old, that's really building its capabilities. You know, one of the things that we've been doing with their board meeting agenda is, one, we've structured it in the way that you've seen so far in the webinar. But quite frankly, at the end of each meeting, we provide an additional 30 minutes for them to break into committees or task forces based off of what's coming out of those meetings or based off of the actual building out of a standing committee. So in this case, so after the meeting ends, you know, instead of the meeting being a 90-minute format, it's a 2-hour format, where they're using the final 30 minutes to actually move into their committees to actually do the committee work. Now, what happens is that, one, the key question, central question that they're discussing will probably inform their work that they're doing. It actually may even set up their work that during the synthesis process, if there is no committee or task force to address certain things, you may forge that committee and task force and then ask that committee or task force to actually then go ahead and meet for 30 minutes. And then to ultimately appoint someone to file a report that will then go into the consent agenda for the next meeting. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it is a difficulty that some boards have that don't have a working committee structure. And And I think that, this could lead to a way, in a very, very relevant way, to identify either committees or task forces to do so. Now, I'm a big proponent, if there aren't any standing committees, to actually then use these that synthesis portion of the agenda to actually then say, all right, let's form a task force. Who's going to sit on the task force? What are you going to get done? And all right, now for the next 30 minutes, we're going to ask you to then sit together and sort of work through this particular issue in a more focused way, and bring your findings back to us. That way they can get together and then figure out what they need to delegate out, what they need to do between meetings, how they're going to then report back ultimately. Okay. I love this concept, someone writes. One challenge I foresee is that engagement takes time of both staff and board. The old agenda doesn't do as much, but doesn't take as much effort either. What tips do you have to efficiently, effectively manage the time investment? Okay. So I'm going to actually tell you is that this is so much better of a time investment, and board members and staff actually begin to recognize it immediately in terms of how this actually is a good use of their time and a good use of that hour and a half that you're doing it either 10 or 11 or 12 times a year in your board meeting. So, what we find is that because people are in discussion, they've moved to that proactive mode, time actually feels like it's moving faster. And I know that, it is, the sense of, of efficiency and effective, being efficient and effective. But what I would say is a lot of that efficiency and effectiveness is baked into perception. So one of the things that I'm going to say is what this does is what this meeting structure does is change people's perception of how board meetings actually work, where people actually look forward to coming to these discussions because they're getting to use their skills, their expertise, and getting to really, in many respects, to share their thoughts and perspectives on how to address some of the most relevant and meaningful challenges the organization faces. Okay, next question that we have. Okay, the format of the handout is odd, and I'm wondering if you can email me a PDF. I will email you a PDF. I'm sorry if it seems odd. Okay. Where do we go to download the presentation? Again, you download the presentation from the handouts bar here in the webinar. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out today and for hanging in for a few more minutes of discussion. Again, like Dana mentioned, please feel free to check our website here, creationcommon.com. I also encourage people to reach out to me via email if you have any questions. There's our phone number as well. And when I can be on Twitter, I am on Twitter. So please, if you're a person who tweets, please reach out to us that way as well. I want to thank everyone for coming out today, and have a great rest of your year. Have a terrific holiday. All right. Bye-bye.